The air inside Graceland that summer carried a strange stillness, as if even the walls understood that something fragile was happening behind closed doors. It was late July of 1977, and Memphis heat pressed against the windows like a heavy hand. Inside the private study, two men who had lived louder than most people ever dared sat in silence that felt heavier than fame, heavier than applause, heavier even than regret. Elvis Presley leaned back in his chair, his once electric presence dimmed but not extinguished. There was still something unmistakable in his eyes, a spark of mischief, a depth of feeling, and beneath it all, a father's worry. Across from him sat Dean Martin, relaxed in posture but alert in spirit, the kind of man who understood when laughter wasn't enough. They had shared stages, late nights, stories the public would never hear, but this was different. This was not about music, not about Hollywood, not about legacy. This was about responsibility. Elvis turned a glass slowly in his hand, ice tapping softly against crystal. "You ever think," he said quietly, "about what happens to the people we leave behind?" Dean studied him carefully. This wasn't casual conversation. This wasn't small talk. Elvis continued before Dean could answer. "Not the headlines, not the estate, not the business. I mean the ones who wake up the next morning and the house feels too quiet." There was no performance in his voice now. No charm. No stage light, just a man confronting the weight of his own humanity. Dean didn't rush his response. He had always understood timing in comedy, in music, in life. "You're talking about Priscilla," he said gently. Elvis nodded. "And Lisa?" Another nod. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. "I made mistakes," Elvis said, not dramatically, not defensively, just truthfully. "I let the world pull at me from too many sides. I thought I could outrun exhaustion. I thought I could fix everything later. Later doesn't always wait." Dean leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not gone," he said firmly. "You're still here." Elvis gave a faint smile. "I know, but I feel the clock louder than I used to." It wasn't fear in his voice, it was clarity. And then he said the words that would echo long after the music stopped. "If something ever happens, I need to know they're protected, not controlled, not managed, protected." Dean's expression didn't change, but something inside him did. Elvis wasn't asking for publicity management. He wasn't asking for business oversight. He was asking for loyalty beyond the spotlight. "Priscilla's strong," Elvis continued. "Stronger than people give her credit for, but this world, it doesn't forgive softness. It sees vulnerability as opportunity. I don't want her navigating that alone." "And Lisa?" Dean asked quietly. Elvis's jaw tightened just slightly. "Lisa deserves truth, not mythology, not a statue of a father, a real one, flawed, human, loving." Dean sat back and exhaled slowly. This wasn't a favor, this wasn't a temporary gesture. This was a promise that would stretch years. "You want me to look after them?" Dean said carefully. Elvis met his eyes fully now. "I want someone who won't use them, someone who understands this business but doesn't worship it, someone who remembers that family comes before fame." The room felt smaller. Outside, tourists walked the grounds unaware that inside, a conversation was unfolding that had nothing to do with concerts or gold records. Dean had always been known for his effortless cool, but this moment wasn't effortless. It was sacred. "You know what you're asking?" Dean said. Elvis nodded. "Yeah, I do." Dean stood and walked toward the window. The lawn stretched green and manicured beyond the glass. Graceland looked peaceful. It always did from the outside. Inside, though, lived a man who understood how easily admiration could turn into pressure. Dean thought of his own children, of responsibility, of reputation, of rumors that could ignite from a single photograph. He turned back. "If I say yes," Dean said slowly, "I'm not stepping in to replace you. I won't rewrite you. I won't pretend to be something I'm not." Elvis's eyes softened. "That's exactly why I'm asking you." The weight of that trust hung between them. Dean walked back across the room and stopped in front of his friend. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Dean extended his hand. "If they ever need someone steady," he said, "I'll be there." Elvis stood slowly and took it. The handshake was firm, not theatrical, two men sealing something that didn't need witnesses. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it mattered. They talked for hours after that, not about death, but about practical things, about guidance, about character, about ensuring that strength didn't turn into isolation. Elvis spoke openly about his hopes for Lisa's independence, about wanting her to grow up without feeling owned by a legacy. Dean listened carefully. Not as a celebrity, as a friend. By the time Dean left Graceland that evening, the sky was painted in deep Memphis orange, fading into purple. Elvis stood at the doorway longer than usual, watching his friend walk down the steps. Neither man knew how soon that promise would be tested. But something had shifted. This wasn't about tragedy. It was about foresight. It was about a man realizing that fame does not protect the people you love. Character does. And Dean Martin had just agreed to something that would challenge his character in ways no stage ever had. Because keeping a promise to the living is easy. Keeping one to the absent, that is where loyalty becomes legacy. And what Dean would choose to do next would surprise everyone, not because it was dramatic, but because it was steady. And steady is rare. In the weeks that followed that quiet promise at Graceland, life did what life always does. It moved forward, even when hearts were still catching up. The world outside continued its rhythm of flashing cameras, sold-out arenas, and headlines that tried to compress human beings into simple stories. But behind those headlines lived something far more complicated. Elvis Presley was still Elvis Presley to the world, the voice, the symbol, the legend. But to the people closest to him, he was something else entirely. He was a father trying to hold on to moments that never stayed long enough. Dean Martin returned to Los Angeles carrying something invisible. He hadn't signed a contract. He hadn't announced anything publicly. There was no press release, no formal declaration. But inside him, something had changed. The promise he had made was not loud, but it was permanent. It followed him into quiet mornings, into late-night thoughts, into moments when laughter filled rooms but didn't reach as deeply as it once had. He understood something most people never realize. That responsibility does not begin when the world notices it. It begins when you accept it in silence. He thought often about Priscilla, not as a public figure, not as someone defined by association, but as a woman who had lived inside a storm that few people understood. Fame did not come with instructions. It did not explain how to remain yourself while the world projected expectations onto you. He knew she carried strength, but he also knew strength could be exhausted. Even the strongest people needed moments where they didn't have to pretend to be unbreakable. He thought about Lisa Marie, too. Children understood loss differently. They did not process it through headlines or explanations. They felt absence in quieter ways, in empty chairs, in unanswered questions, in moments when instinct told them to turn toward someone who was no longer there. Dean understood that protecting someone didn't mean shielding them from truth. It meant making sure they never faced truth alone. One evening in early August, Dean found himself sitting alone in his living room long after the rest of the house had gone quiet. The television flickered without sound. His drink sat untouched on the table beside him. His thoughts wandered back to Memphis, to that room, to that handshake. Promises, he realized, didn't announce themselves with ceremony. They revealed themselves later, in moments when action was required instead of words. Then came the day when the world shifted. The news spread quickly, faster than truth usually does, faster than grief could settle. Phones rang across cities. Voices spoke in hushed tones, repeating words that felt impossible to accept. The world reacted loudly, but inside homes, inside hearts, the reaction was quieter. He heard the news like everyone else did, through the cold distance of a voice delivering facts that could never capture emotion. Dean didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to consider public reaction. He didn't calculate perception. He simply remembered his promise. The flight to Memphis felt longer than usual, even though the distance hadn't changed. Time stretched differently when responsibility waited at the destination. He watched the clouds pass beneath him and understood that when he landed, nothing would be the same. Not for Priscilla, not for Lisa Marie, and not for him. Graceland stood exactly where it always had, but it no longer felt like the same place. There was a stillness that replaced energy, a quiet that replaced movement, not emptiness but absence, the kind that could not be filled quickly, if ever. Dean entered without announcement. He wasn't there as a public figure. He wasn't there as a performer. He was there as a friend who had given his word. He saw Priscilla across the room. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't surrounded by cameras or reporters or attention. She was simply sitting, holding herself with a kind of composure that came not from lack of feeling, but from necessity. When she saw him, her expression didn't break. It softened. He didn't speak immediately. He simply walked closer and sat beside her. Sometimes presence said more than language ever could. "I came," he said quietly. She nodded, her voice steady but fragile beneath the surface. "I knew you would." There were no dramatic declarations, no theatrical reassurances, just understanding. Over the next hours, Dean watched the world begin to press in. Calls came, questions came, people came, everyone needed something, statements, decisions, access, information. Grief became public property faster than it could be privately processed. Dean didn't argue with anyone, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't assert authority through force. He simply stood where he needed to stand. Between chaos and vulnerability. Between pressure and protection. He answered when necessary, he declined when appropriate. He allowed space where space was needed. He understood something others didn't, that protection wasn't loud, it was steady. It was consistent, it was quiet strength applied at the right moments. He saw Lisa Marie briefly, her presence smaller than the magnitude of the moment surrounding her. She didn't fully understand the permanence of absence. Children rarely did at first. They understood change before they understood loss. Dean didn't try to explain anything. He didn't pretend to have answers that no one truly had. He simply knelt beside her and spoke gently, not about endings, but about continuity. About how love didn't disappear simply because presence did. About how memory carried its own kind of protection. Over the following days, the world watched closely. Cameras captured movement. Headlines speculated. Narratives formed quickly, often without understanding. People noticed Dean's presence. They noticed his consistency. They noticed that he remained nearby without drawing attention to himself. Some assumed motives. Some misunderstood intentions. But Dean didn't respond to speculation. He responded to responsibility. Priscilla noticed it most clearly in the quiet moments, when decisions needed to be made and he offered perspective without pressure, when questions arose and he answered honestly without influence, when uncertainty appeared and he remained steady without trying to control. He didn't step forward as a replacement. He stepped forward as reinforcement. He never tried to become something he was. He simply remained someone dependable. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the trees surrounding Graceland, Priscilla found herself standing outside, watching light fade into shadow. Dean stood beside her, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. After a long silence, she spoke. "You didn't have to come." He shook his head slightly. "Yes," he said, "I did." She looked at him, understanding more in that moment than explanation could provide. Because she realized something important. Dean hadn't come out of obligation. He had come out of honor. And honor, unlike fame, didn't disappear when attention moved elsewhere. It stayed. It acted. It protected. And though the world didn't yet understand what Dean Martin was quietly choosing to do, it would soon. Because the most shocking thing wasn't dramatic action. It was unwavering consistency. And Dean Martin was only beginning to show just how far he would go to keep his promise. The weeks after the funeral did not quiet the world, they only changed its tone. Grief had been public, but speculation was louder. The headlines that once mourned now began to analyze, question, and invent. Fame has a way of refusing stillness, and the absence of one legend created space for a new narrative to form. People were not satisfied with the idea of loyalty. They preferred scandal. They preferred drama. They preferred something that felt larger than ordinary decency. And so, when Dean Martin continued to show up, when he continued to stand beside Priscilla in meetings, when he remained present in ways that were quiet but visible, assumptions began to grow. Dean noticed it first in the subtle glances at industry gatherings, conversations that paused when he entered a room, questions disguised as jokes. He had lived in Hollywood long enough to recognize when whispers were building into stories. But what unsettled him was not his own reputation. He had weathered rumor before. What unsettled him was how easily protection could be misinterpreted as possession, and how quickly sincerity could be twisted into suggestion. Priscilla felt it too. Invitations shifted in tone. Interviews began to include carefully phrased questions about support systems and new influences. Photographers lingered longer when Dean happened to arrive or leave a gathering nearby. It was as though the world needed to attach meaning to his presence that went beyond friendship. They did not understand that loyalty could exist without motive. They did not understand that a promise did not require romance to sustain it. One evening in Los Angeles, several months after the world had settled into its new reality, Priscilla sat across from Dean at her dining table. The house was quiet. Lisa Marie was asleep upstairs, the day's questions finally exhausted for the night. The lights were low, not for secrecy but for calm. Outside, the city hummed in its usual restless rhythm. "They're talking again," Priscilla said softly, her voice measured but weary. "They say you're trying to step into a role that isn't yours." Dean leaned back in his chair and studied her expression. He saw not anger but fatigue, not outrage but frustration. She had spent years being interpreted instead of understood. He knew that exhaustion well. "I'm not stepping into anything," he replied calmly. "I'm standing where I said I would." She nodded, but her eyes reflected something deeper. "I don't want this to cost you. Your marriage, your peace, your reputation. I never asked for that." Dean exhaled slowly, the weight of perception pressing in on him in ways he hadn't anticipated when he first extended his hand in Memphis. Loyalty, he realized, sometimes demanded sacrifice not just of time, but of comfort. "I made the choice," he said firmly. "Not you, not anyone else. If there's a cost, it's mine to carry." But even as he said it, he understood that the cost was not theoretical. It was already forming in quiet conversations at home. His wife, Jean, had always known the world they lived in. She had always understood that fame created illusions, but this was different. This was sustained proximity, sustained visibility, sustained speculation. One night, after returning from a quiet dinner meeting meant solely to discuss estate matters, Dean found Jean waiting in their living room. There was no accusation in her posture, but there was concern. "You've been gone more than usual," she said gently, "and the stories are getting louder." Dean did not dismiss her feelings. He did not minimize them. "I gave my word," he said simply. Jean studied him carefully. She knew the man she had married. She knew that when he committed to something, it was not performative. It was personal. "I'm not asking you to break it," she said. "I'm asking you to protect what we have too." The room held a different kind of tension now, not public, not dramatic, just intimate and honest. Dean realized then that loyalty was not singular. It branched. It affected more than one direction. Protecting one promise could strain another relationship if not handled with care. "I won't let this become something it isn't," he said with quiet conviction. "There are boundaries, I know them." And he did. He began adjusting his approach not by withdrawing but by refining. Meetings became more structured, appearances more discreet. He avoided public restaurants when possible, choosing private offices or home discussions instead. He reduced opportunities for misinterpretation without reducing commitment. It was a careful balance, one that required discipline and awareness. Loyalty did not mean recklessness. It meant responsibility. Meanwhile, Lisa Marie was growing more observant. Children often sense emotional currents before adults believe they do. She noticed the way people watched her mother. She noticed the way cameras lingered. She noticed that Dean was always present but never imposing. He attended school events quietly, sitting in the back row, applauding without fanfare. He spoke to her not as someone burdened by legacy, but as a child learning who she was outside of it. One afternoon, after a school recital, Lisa approached him in the parking lot. "They say you're trying to be my new dad," she said plainly, her voice innocent but searching. Dean knelt slightly so he was eye level with her. "I'm not trying to be anyone new," he answered gently. "I'm just someone who cares about you." She studied his face for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." It was enough. Because children measure sincerity differently than adults do. They don't listen for headlines, they listen for tone, and she heard steadiness in his voice. As the year turned and seasons shifted, the rumors began to lose momentum. The world grew bored when it could not find scandal. There were no dramatic declarations, no inappropriate photographs, no confrontations, just consistency. And consistency does not sell newspapers the way chaos does. But what truly shocked those who had expected something sensational was not what Dean did publicly. It was what he continued to do privately. He met with legal advisors to ensure estate protections were solid without overreaching. He encouraged Priscilla to make independent decisions rather than rely solely on his guidance. He reminded her often, "This is your life. I'm here to support, not to steer." He made sure Lisa Marie's education remained stable, that security did not become suffocating, and that grief did not become identity. He did not try to control narrative. He focused on character. And over time, something unexpected happened. The world stopped seeing proximity as scandal. It began seeing it as something else entirely: integrity. Industry colleagues who had initially questioned his motives began to understand the depth of his commitment. There were no financial entanglements, no hidden benefits, no opportunistic arrangements, just time, advice, presence, and protection. One evening, nearly a year after that conversation in Memphis, Dean found himself once again standing outside under a fading sunset. Priscilla joined him quietly. "You never wavered," she said. He looked out toward the horizon, the sky painted in colors that reminded him of that first evening at Graceland. "I don't know how to," he replied. And it was true. Dean Martin had lived decades under lights, but this was different. This was not performance. It was principle. And principle, unlike applause, did not fade when attention shifted elsewhere. The world had expected drama. It had expected replacement. It had expected something scandalous or self-serving. Instead, it witnessed something rarer. A man who meant what he said. And though many still did not fully understand it, though some would always question, the truth remained steady beneath the noise. Elvis had asked. Dean had answered. And loyalty, when carried long enough without fracture, becomes something more than a promise. It becomes legacy. The story, however, was not finished. Because the real test of loyalty is not in the first year of grief. It is in the years that follow, when the world stops watching. And what Dean would choose to do when attention faded would reveal even more than what he had done while it burned brightly. Time has a way of revealing whether a promise was emotional or intentional. In the first months after loss, people show up out of sympathy, out of shock, out of instinct. But as seasons change and headlines fade, most drift back to their own lives. Grief becomes quieter, less visible. Support becomes less expected. And that is when loyalty is truly tested, not in the storm, but in the stillness that follows it. For Dean Martin, the years that followed were not dramatic. There were no grand announcements, no public declarations about responsibility. He did not build his identity around the promise he had made. He simply integrated it into his life as naturally as breathing. And that quiet integration was what shocked those who assumed it would fade. Priscilla slowly began rebuilding her independence. She learned to navigate meetings without feeling overwhelmed. She learned which advisors to trust and which to question. She learned that strength did not mean refusing help, and vulnerability did not mean weakness. Dean's role was never to stand in front of her. It was to stand slightly behind, steady and ready, but never intrusive. When business proposals came across her desk, he offered perspective without pressure. When opportunities arose, he asked questions instead of giving commands. He treated her not as someone fragile, but as someone capable who simply deserved honesty. Lisa Marie grew older, and with age came deeper questions. Childhood curiosity slowly turned into adolescent introspection. There were moments of frustration, moments of identity confusion, moments when being associated with a global icon felt less like honor and more like burden. Dean understood that too. He had lived long enough under lights to know that applause could become expectation, and expectation could become weight. Never tried to shape her into something. He did not impose values through lectures or rigid guidance. Instead, he told stories, not polished myths, not exaggerated heroics, stories about humanity, about mistakes, about resilience. He described Elvis not as an untouchable legend, but as a man who laughed easily, who loved deeply, who sometimes struggled quietly. He allowed complexity to exist. He refused to simplify memory into something unreal, and that honesty created trust. One afternoon, years after the world had largely stopped speculating about his presence, Lisa Marie sat across from him in a quiet cafe patio tucked away from busy streets. She was old enough now to recognize patterns in people. She studied him thoughtfully and asked, "Why did you stay when it would have been easier to leave?" Dean paused before answering, not because he lacked words, but because he respected the weight of the question. "Because easy doesn't define character," he said calmly. "And because your father believed I wouldn't choose easy." She absorbed that slowly. In that moment, she wasn't looking at a celebrity. She was looking at a man who had demonstrated consistency for years without applause. That consistency had become a foundation in her life. Not loud, not dominating, just dependable. Meanwhile, Dean's own life continued with its own rhythms and challenges. Aging brings its own reflections. The body slows. The mind revisits old decisions. He occasionally wondered how different his life might have been had he chosen distance instead of involvement. There were moments when balancing responsibilities required careful navigation. There were times when public perception brushed against private peace, but regret never settled in his heart. He understood that loyalty often costs comfort, but it pays in meaning. The world around them evolved. New stars emerged. New headlines replaced old ones. Fame rotated its spotlight. What once seemed like front-page intensity became historical reference. And yet, through every shift, Dean's presence remained steady. Birthdays were acknowledged. Milestones were celebrated. Difficult seasons were supported. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't glamorous. It was relational. Priscilla once remarked quietly during a small family gathering, "You never tried to replace anything. You just reinforced what mattered." That distinction meant everything. Replacement suggests erasure. Reinforcement suggests respect. Dean had never sought to stand where Elvis once stood. He had simply ensured that absence did not create vulnerability. As the decades progressed, something even more meaningful began to unfold. Lisa Marie developed her own identity separate from legacy. She pursued interests, made decisions, navigated adulthood with both independence and reflection. She carried her father's name, but she did not allow it to consume her. That balance did not happen by accident. It happened because someone had quietly helped her see that identity is built, not inherited. Dean watched that growth with quiet satisfaction, not pride in ownership but gratitude in participation. He had never wanted recognition. He had wanted stability, and stability had been achieved not through grand gestures but through accumulated presence. There were moments, of course, when he questioned whether the world would ever fully understand what he had chosen. But as years turned into nearly 2 decades, understanding from the world mattered less than the impact within a small circle of lives. Public opinion shifts quickly. Private gratitude endures. In the later years of his life, when Dean's own health began to slow him, he reflected often on that afternoon in Memphis when a handshake sealed something larger than either man likely realized. He did not see it as sacrifice. He saw it as alignment. Alignment between words and actions, between loyalty and longevity, between friendship and responsibility. When Dean passed away, the tributes that followed spoke of music, of charm, of humor. But among the private memories shared at quieter gatherings was something deeper. Priscilla spoke not of scandal, not of rumor, not of public narrative, but of steadiness. She described a man who never inserted himself into headlines, who never sought benefit from proximity, who simply honored a promise without fanfare. Lisa Marie described something even more profound. She spoke of consistency, of someone who showed up when cameras were absent, of someone who answered hard questions honestly, of someone who never exploited connection for advantage. In a world where relationships often become transactional, she had experienced something different, unconditional guidance rooted in loyalty. What truly shocked everyone in the end was not that Dean Martin stayed involved. It was that he never wavered. In an industry defined by image and reinvention, he chose constancy. In a culture fascinated by scandal, he offered steadiness. In a world where promises are often temporary, he treated one as permanent. Years earlier, Elvis had asked for protection, not control, not management, protection rooted in integrity. Dean had understood that distinction. Protection did not mean making decisions for someone. It meant ensuring they were never pressured into making them alone. It meant guarding dignity without suffocating independence. It meant honoring memory without being consumed by it. The most powerful acts rarely make headlines. They unfold quietly across time. They require no audience. They demand no applause. They exist simply because someone chose to mean what they said. And that is why the story endured. Because when everything else faded, the rumors, the speculation, the assumptions, what remained was evidence. Evidence of presence. Evidence of guidance. Evidence of a promise kept not for a year, not for convenience, but for a lifetime. Elvis had asked. Dean had answered. And in the years that followed, he proved that loyalty is not measured in dramatic gestures, but in sustained action. He proved that character is not built in public moments, but in private decisions repeated over time. He proved that friendship does not end when a voice falls silent. It continues in the care extended to those left behind. That was what truly shocked everyone. Not scandal, not spectacle, but steadfast honor. And in a world that often forgets what honor looks like, that kind of steadiness becomes unforgettable.